Hello viewers, and welcome to the player card review of the final adventure pack of the Dwarrowdelf cycle of adventure packs. This is Shadow and Flame. This is another entry in the LOTR LCG progression series, which is a production of Cardboard of the Rings, the bi-weekly podcast about the Lord of the Rings, the card game, which itself is a living card game by Fantasy Flight Games. This is Mitch.
And this is Matthew.
And why don't we start things off by taking a look at our new hero.
The final hero of the Dwarrowdelf cycle is the lore hero Elrond, who clocks in at a hefty 13 threat cost with 3 willpower, 2 attack strength, 3 defense strength, 4 hit points. He is both Noldor and Noble, and you may spend resources from Elrond's resource pool to pay for spirit, leadership, and tactics allies. He also has a response. After a character is healed by another card effect, heal 1 damage on it. So right off the bat, Elrond is the highest threat cost hero in the game at this point. And I think even currently he's still the highest threat cost hero. And his threat is higher than the sum of his stats. His stats add up to 12, so he costs 1 more than that. I think one way you could sort of counterbalance his astronomically high threat cost is to use the hero from the last adventure pack, Glorfindel, who only has 5. So they'd be combined at 17, which is still relatively high, but it could certainly be worse. And if you're not going to use the spirit version of Glorfindel, having the Corset version, which I so lovingly call Corfindel, would actually be pretty good too because of Elrond's response. Now, you don't necessarily both have to control them, because that would be 12 and 13, but that combination would mean Glorfindel can pay 1 resource to heal 2 damage off of any character. So I definitely appreciate Elrond's response to basically add to the healing power of any healing effect, whether it's Corfindel or it's the Warden of Healing or something like that. It's quite handy.
So, the first thing that stands out about Elrond to me is his absolutely incredible stats. So whether you need a potent willpower character, he's able to provide that. Whether you need some sort of incredible defending character, he's got in-sphere matches with a burning brand. So he's got 3 defense and he's canceling shadow effects. Lore has a ton of healing cards, just like Matthew mentioned, and he's able to naturally enhance the potency of that healing. So if you slap something like a self-preservation on him, he can defend against, say, a 6-attack Hill Troll or even Durin's Bane, turn after turn, and so long as that effect isn't amplified in any way, he can just act as an incredibly resilient tank for the players. One of my favorite combos with this card that you mentioned is that Warden of Healing. So for just a cost of 2, you're essentially able to heal more effectively than 2 Daughters of the Nimrodel, just because you can kind of split that healing stream between any number of characters as opposed to merely heroes. Even though Elrond does have that extremely high threat value, he's also got a built-in resource fixing effect, where if you find him with a surplus of allies from any number of resource acceleration effects, whether it's Steward of Gondor, Horn of Gondor, or whatever it happens to be, he's able to pay for allies of any sphere whatsoever. And once we discuss a neutral card that comes along with this adventure pack, it's very likely that you'll be including cards in your deck that don't happen to have a regular sphere match with any of your heroes.
Because Elrond is a unique Noldor character, cards like the Light of Valinor or Elrond's Council are also nice effects that will work wonderfully with Elrond in play.
Especially considering that you want to get as much use as possible out of this character that has a number of different stats that have very high scores. Really, the last card that comes to mind for Elrond is maybe something like Protector of Lorien, just because if you are using him in a defensive capacity, it's great to be able to, in a pinch, bolster his defensive value, especially because his pool of hit points, while impressive, is still trumped by a few other powerful defenders. So, now that we've covered our new lore hero, why don't we go ahead and take a look at our leadership cards, the first of which is an event called We Are Not Idle, which for a cost of 0 reads action, exhaust X dwarf characters to add X resources to a hero's resource pool, and draw 1 card. So, the first thing that comes to mind in discussing this card is that it's strikingly similar to Lore's Darren's Runes, in that this is a 0-cost event that essentially replaces itself. So, even if you're not really considering using this for any sort of resource acceleration, so long as you're playing a deck that includes at least one leadership hero, this to me seems like an auto-include. Even if players aren't running any dwarf characters whatsoever, in triggering this action, they can choose to exhaust 0 dwarf characters to add 0 resources, and this card still automatically replaces itself. So if you're running a 50-card deck, if you include 3 copies of We Are Not Idle, you're essentially running a 47-card deck, which, although it might not seem like it makes a big numerical difference, it nevertheless kind of speeds up the rate at which you'll draw your most potent cards, whether Steward of Gondor or Lure of Moria, whatever it happens to be. There's really no downside to including this card in a leadership deck.
I think the more conventional use of this card is the combination with Lure of Moria, which is that 3-cost event that readies all dwarf characters. So what you can do is exhaust every single dwarf character that you control to add however many resources you would like to a hero of your choice, then play Lure of Moria for 3 to then ready all your dwarf characters. So it's definitely a very nice way to get some resource acceleration quite quickly, especially if your dwarf army is pretty massive.
Just like you mentioned the Lure of Moria, so long as a player has more than 3 dwarf characters, if they play that event, they're essentially gaining a surplus of resources. So if you exhaust 6 characters and you only use 3 resources to cover that Lure of Moria, you're gaining a 3-resource surplus. Maybe if you have actions left over at the end of the round, you can exhaust some of your dwarf characters to derive a little bit of a resource benefit, and of course We Are Not Idle automatically replaces itself, like I talked about. I think one of the most powerful aspects of this card is that you don't necessarily have to pick one of your own heroes, and there's no sphere-specific clause, whereas Parting Gifts, for example, you have to transfer resources from a leadership hero's resource pool. So for any player in the game, if they've got a hero that's really hurting for resources, whatever effect they're struggling to get into play, We Are Not Idle is a fantastic way of helping to facilitate that. Really, the last combo I think is worth mentioning for this card is that Legacy of Durin. So if you're using a lot of dwarves to generate a lot of resources, if you put a lot more dwarves into play, it gives you even more cards to play even more dwarves to maybe next turn generate even more resources.
So speaking of even more of dwarves, the next card is an attachment, Hardy Leadership. It has a cost of 2, and it must attach to a leadership hero. And it makes your dwarves just a little bit hardier. They each get +1 hit point. I think that sort of just on paper, that 1 extra hit point doesn't sound like a lot. But in practice, in pretty much every game I've ever played with my buddies when we've been running Hardy Leadership, that 1 extra hit point has really come in helpful. It could help Glowin generate even more resources. It could help Gimli attack for even more. And even the Veteran of the Nanduhirian could become a better blocker with the addition of 1 extra hit point.
So it goes without saying that if you're playing dwarves, you're likely to have Dane Ironfoot in play. He's a leadership hero, and as soon as you're able to stick Hardy Leadership to him, not only does he become a more formidable defender, but he helps to overcome one of the primary weaknesses that the dwarves face, particularly during questing. So they have a ton of very potent allies, like Sigil Minor and Erebor Recordkeeper, that are able to commit to the quest, maybe for a couple willpower. Maybe you're relying on effects like Untroubled by Darkness to just transform them into absolute powerhouses during the questing phase. But the huge weakness there is those allies only have a single hit point, so an effect like Dark and Dreadful or the Necromancer's Reach can essentially clear the table of these potent little allies. But Hardy Leadership helps overcome that, so if you're not playing Spirit, if you don't have cancel when revealed effects to rely on, you're able to kind of overcome and circumvent that one damage, where if it happens, it's not the end of the world, your characters remain in play. Maybe if you've got effects like Warden of Healing sitting on the table, he's able to kind of split his healing stream and strip all of that damage away before it ever needs destroy an ally. Even though this might seem like a very subtle effect, there are countless situations. For example, Gimli in Journey Along the Anduin defending against a hill troll that gets +1 attack strength, where that 1 point can just make all the difference.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Mitch. And I think the other weakness of the dwarves that you didn't necessarily mention is sort of interestingly, and Brandon mentioned this on one of the more recent episodes on the podcast, is dwarves don't have that high a defense, or at least most of the allies don't. But even some of the heroes, quite a good number of them are sitting at 0 or 1 defense. So this is sort of a way to globally boost the dwarves in a way that Dane doesn't already do. He's boosting up their willpower, boosting up their attack, and now you can boost up their hit points, which sort of in a way could be viewed as bumping up their defense. So I think this is a stellar attachment that really shouldn't be underestimated.
Certainly, there are plenty of games where you're going to be able to drop this into play and it's not going to end up making a difference, but kind of just like you pointed out, maybe an already hardy defending character like an Erebor Hammersmith is going to be able to do a double chump blocker duty instead of just one time, so I'm definitely excited to put this card in my decks.
In terms of just relative power of cards, as much as I like the Boots of Erebor from the Khazad-dûm Deluxe expansion, this, because it affects each dwarf character, whether you control it or your buddies control it, it's much, much better than that 0-cost attachment that gives one lowly dwarf 1 extra hit point. So certainly you could be playing with both if you really want to pump up a dwarf's hit points, but you get much more bang for your buck with Hardy Leadership.
So next up is the one new tactics player card of this adventure pack, which is Hands Upon the Bow, which for the cost of 1 is an event that reads Action, exhaust a character you control with the ranged keyword to immediately declare it as an attacker and resolve its attack against an enemy in the staging area. It gets +1 attack strength during this attack. So straight away, I like that this is a cheap effect. It kind of reminds me of Hail of Stones in that you're able to snipe an enemy in the staging area. So long as you have a powerful ranged attacker that can pull this off, you're able to eliminate the threat of an enemy, you're able to prevent it from ever being able to attack you, and maybe you're able to circumvent any number of nasty effects. I think the primary challenge of this card is that so far as we've seen at this point, there really aren't very many powerful ranged attackers.
I think a lot of solo players were very excited to see this card because it finally made ranged somewhat more useful as opposed to not being useful at all in a solo game. So now if you want to include heroes like Legolas, or for heaven's sakes, Bran, son of Bane, or even some of the other ranged heroes that will be coming out a little bit later in the game, this gives them some added utility from having that keyword, again, if you're playing solo. Beyond that, though, as Mitch mentioned, it certainly is helpful clearing out the staging area, perhaps before quest resolution. What I don't like about this card, and what I don't like about a lot of the ranged utility cards, we'll get to some more in the Hobbit Saga expansions, is that if you're playing tactics, those heroes tend to have a relatively high starting threat, especially if you're playing mono tactics. And so oftentimes, there are not enemies in the staging area past the quest resolution step. So in some senses, this is a better card than some of the attachments that give you a similar ability, but you really need to make sure there is something in the staging area in the first place to be able to play this. If they're all engaging you, or things like Goblin Follower that instantly engages you or whatever, it can be circumvented, and the utility of this card can be decreased a little bit, but all things considered, I think this is a nice addition to the tactics sphere. Certainly those players like me who love doing ranged damage.
particularly if players are taking advantage of effects like Rivendell Blade and Dunedain Mark, where they can beef up a ranged character to be reliably able to kill enemies. I definitely think this can help tactics players to make a more significant questing contribution. This is very similar to the card Quick Strike, but it has the added benefit that you're able to, just like I mentioned, deal with threat and nasty abilities, in addition to avoiding an attack. Something else interesting to point out about this card is that it doesn't involve anything to do with requiring the character to have the printed ranged keywords, so maybe if a character has Gimli loaded up with all sorts of damage and other effects, so long as you're able to slap something like a Dunedain Cash on him, he's maybe got enough attack strength to do something like snipe a cave troll in the staging area. So in certain situations, this card seems incredibly powerful, but even without taking it to a ridiculous level, it nevertheless seems like a very useful addition to tactics. Really, the last thing I think mentioning about this event is that if a player is playing pretty heavy tactics, maybe they can have large enemies come and engage with them, and maybe take advantage of an effect like Hama being able to attack them and kind of recycling this card, so that they can reliably snipe these small enemies from the staging area, and maybe conserve chump blockers and other effects for dealing with that one big nasty enemy. Before we move on, I think there's one final card worth addressing when it comes to Hands Upon the Bow, and that is Rivendell Bow. This tactics attachment confers a +1 attack strength bonus to the attached character during a ranged attack. But what's worth mentioning is that Hands Upon the Bow, even though it's a ranged character declaring that attack, has actually been clarified by Caleb Grace that it does not count as a ranged attack. In fact, he responded to one FFG forum goer by saying, "As the card is currently worded, Hands Upon the Bow grants a normal attack and not a ranged attack. So, whereas it seems like it would make sense that you would essentially get a +2 attack strength bonus if you're using this event and you have that attachment on that character, unfortunately, that does not seem to be the case."
On to our spirit cards, the first of which is O Elbereth Gilthoniel. It is an event that costs 4 and also has a secrecy value of 4, so potentially free, and its response reads, after an enemy attacks you, put that enemy on the bottom of the encounter deck. If your threat is lower than that enemy's engagement cost, set your threat equal to the engagement cost of that enemy. So this is an interesting card, especially in a secrecy deck, because there's the potential of raising your threat quite a bit. And if that is the case, I think this would be a very nice card to combo with the lore version of Aragorn. So if you do raise your threat as a result of this card, you could then reset it at least once per game to your starting level. But perhaps some more practical enemies to use this card with would be the tentacle enemies in the third adventure pack of this cycle, where their engagement costs are relatively low, in the teens, but their effects are nasty, either when you're defending against them or trying to attack them back. This way you can get rid of them, and odds are, if you're playing a secrecy deck, you're either not raising your threat, or you don't have to raise it above the secrecy threshold.
Certainly this is a little bit of a confusing card, in that it's got a very steep cost, but with secrecy it is free. Of course, you also run the risk of, if you're playing this on a pretty powerful enemy, an example comes to mind like the Witch-King, who's got an engagement cost of 40, but during massing at Osgiliath, while he's sitting there in the staging area, he's not only contributing 6 threat, but he's also globally reducing every character's willpower. So it's an extremely nasty effect, but if a secrecy player wanted to pick him as the target, they'd be potentially gaining anywhere between 20 and 30 points of threat. Of course, there is the option of taking advantage of this card as a one-time save your ass type effect. So once the Witch-King is on the bottom of the encounter deck, chances are you're going to be able to push through the rest of the scenario without too much difficulty. Maybe at that point you're no longer going to need to take advantage of the secrecy threshold. And certainly there are enough low engagement cost enemies, just like you mentioned, that are coming out in future scenarios that, so long as players are able to maintain that secrecy threshold, this is essentially a free kill. Really, the only other important things to take into consideration with this card is you do have to deal with one resolved attack. So the enemy does get one chance to mess you up before you're able to drop it to the bottom of the encounter deck. And there are certain situations, for example, the Watcher comes to mind, where certain enemies contain victory points that are absolutely vital to your winning that scenario. So even though in the Watcher and the Water quest you've also got that Doors of Durin option, I'm sure there are going to be situations in the future where you're not going to have this convenient out against that enemy. But certainly the thing to keep in mind about this card is there are countless situations where a massive gain in threat and an abysmal score can be much preferable to losing the scenario.
In the extreme late game, if you're running a secrecy deck, I don't know if this card is ultimately all that worth it. Most of the big sort of boss-like enemies do come down on the final quest cards. Because, for example, if you have to raise your threat from under 20 to 30 or 40 something, that means every enemy that you were sneaking by secretly throughout the entire quest will now be swarming down on you the very next turn. So unless you've had some way to take care of those enemies in the staging area ahead of time, whether with Hands Upon the Bow, Dune here, or some other ability to target the staging area, this could be a very dangerous card if there are a lot of enemies in the staging area, where the engagement cost of these enemies will now be equal to your massively high threat level. So the final spirit card of the Dwarrowdelf cycle is Miruvor. It's an attachment that costs 1. It's an item that must attach to a hero, and the action reads, discard Miruvor to choose 2. Ready a hero, or add 1 resource to attached hero's resource pool, or the attached hero gets +1 willpower until the end of round, or put Miruvor on the top of your deck. So you get 4 options, you have to choose 2. My show notes here are very brief. Very nice, versatile card. I think it's entirely obvious how this card should be used, so I will not have much to say. I don't know if I've ever used it in a deck, but I've certainly seen it used to great effect. It's sort of a one-shot, unexpected courage where you could get an extra resource, so in essence it could be paying for itself. I haven't seen as many of my buddies who use this card a lot use it for the willpower. It's typically the first 2 effects, though every once in a while they will put it back on top of their deck so they can take advantage of that redding effect or the extra resource again the following turn.
Players can definitely use that ready attached hero option to take advantage of Miruvor's card draw, or maybe having her draw some cards and committing her to the quest, or having Denethor do his scry effect, and then he's ready to take advantage of his 3 defense value during combat. This also allows for a little bit of resource smoothing if you want to essentially transfer 1 resource from a character with a spirit resource match to any other character. So you can use that resource to pay for Miruvor, put it on whatever other hero, and when you discard it, you can add 1 resource to that hero's pool in addition to what other effect you choose. It can also act as a little bit of a recyclable unexpected courage, where for the cost of 1, maybe you ready a character and then return it to the top of your deck, but unless you're running some sort of card advantage effect, then that kind of has the penalty of clogging up your deck. I certainly think this is a card that had much more potency before we saw Miruvor nerfed in an FAQ update, but if you're running effects like Erebor Hammersmith, or you need a lot of readying effects, like if you're relying on Peace and Thought we'll cover in just a moment, it can nevertheless be a relatively useful effect. So, on to our trio of lore cards, the first of which is an ally called Master of the Forge, which for a cost of 2 has 0 willpower, 0 attack, 1 defense, and 1 hit point. It has the traits Noldor and Craftsman, and reads Action. Exhaust Master of the Forge to search the top 5 cards of your deck for any one attachment and add it to your hand. Shuffle the other cards back into your deck. So, similar to Gleowine, this adds a little bit of card advantage to players, but it has the restriction where you're only able to fish for attachments. It has the added benefit that you can kind of look at the top 5 cards and pick which one of those that you want, but it also has that added limitation that this effect can whiff entirely.
I don't have much to say about this card because I think its uses are relatively obvious and don't need me to belabor the point. But even what I'm going to say is, I think, rather obvious in that he has 1 hit point. So as we say for almost every single ally with only 1 hit point, you want to be careful when you use his exhaust action. Because if you do it before the quest and those nasty treacheries come out that damage exhausted characters, it's bye-bye Master of the Forge.
So, as our resident champion of belaboring the point, I'll just go ahead and point out that a fantastic combo for this guy is the Imladris Stargazer or Gildor Inglorian. So, once you're able to look at the top X cards of your deck, whether it's 3, whether it's 5, if you don't have any sort of powerful card advantage effect where you're drawing a lot of those cards, it's very similar to top decking, so even though you're able to look at the top X cards, you're really only introducing 1 new card into that mix each and every subsequent turn. Once you trigger Master of the Forge, not only can you grab whatever most useful attachment is present in those top X cards, but you're also able to shuffle your deck so that on subsequent rounds, you're able to get way more utility out of those deck scrying effects. Another advantage of this ally is that since it's not unique, you can certainly play multiple copies of Master of the Forge to really expedite your own deck digging, but a limitation of this ally is that unlike the Stargazer, you're not able to influence any other players. But since we're going to be covering an extraordinarily powerful unique attachment a little bit later on in this video, Master of the Forge could be the perfect option to try and fish for that.
The next lore card of the trio here in this adventure pack is Peace and Thought, an event that costs 1. Its refresh action reads, exhaust 2 heroes to draw 5 cards. So right off the bat, this card is cheaper than Lorien's Wealth, but it has that added sort of exhaustion cost. So for some players, this might be too steep a cost, and Lorien's Wealth in some senses is more affordable. But if you're running effects like Miruvor that we talked about just a moment ago, which can ready a hero, or of course the ever-trusty Unexpected Courage, this could be a very powerful card. I think there are plenty of examples in our progression series thus far where Mitch and or I have ready heroes at the end of a round because either no enemies came off the encounter deck, or we just didn't need to use our Unexpected Courage, or now with the addition of Miruvor, perhaps we wouldn't have used that. That exhausting 2 heroes is less of an issue the more and more readying effects we get. You could also use Erebor Record Keeper to ready a hero to help you to pay for this. It increases the resource cost a smidge for that particular combo, but there are many, many ways at this point in the game to ready heroes, and once we dig into those Hobbit boxes next, there are even more. So I don't know if the exhaust 2 heroes is actually all that bad of a cost. Again, with any card here, you're going to build your deck to maximize the effects. So if you're worried about exhausting heroes to draw cards, then this isn't for you. But if you know you're going to be putting in your deck, then you're going to be including plenty of hero readying effects to take full advantage of this very cheap, very potent event.
Really, the big limitation to Peace and Thought is the fact that it's a refresh action. So once you ready your characters for the following round, this has to be the very first thing that you do. So if you're using characters like the spirit version of Glorfindel, even if he has Light of Valinor attached, if he goes into questing already exhausted, then he's not going to be able to commit to the quest. If you're planning on taking advantage of global readying effects, you have to commit all of your characters to the quest at the same time, so if you already have characters exhausted, you can't really make sure that all of your characters are unexhausted and committing to the quest. Maybe you're still going to have two heroes that, even though they're ready once you move on to staging, they're not going to be committed to the quest. Matthew has already mentioned a host of different readying effects that make this a much more feasible card to play, but certainly other options would include heroes like Prince Imrahil or Boromir, where they have a readily accessible built-in readying effect, or maybe the extremely cheap Hobbit attachment Fast Hitch. So I think, just like you said, Matthew, so long as you're able to build around this card, drawing 5 cards is certainly an extremely powerful effect. So, our final lore card in this adventure pack is Risk Some Light, an event for the cost of 3, which also has Secrecy 3. And it is action. Look at the top 3 cards of the encounter deck. You may select one card and move it to the bottom of the encounter deck. Return any unselected cards to the top of the encounter deck in any order. So, immediately this jumps out at me as the most powerful encounter scrying effect we've seen yet. Certainly it's awfully expensive if you're not taking advantage of that secrecy threshold, but the ability to move an encounter card to the bottom of the deck is a very potent Denethor-esque type effect, where if it's some incredibly nasty card, it's very likely that you're never actually going to have to deal with it.
Well, I think the natural comparison is to another secrecy card from the Road to Rivendell adventure pack, which is Out of the Wild. That costs 3 secrecy 2, but its action reads, search the top 5 cards of the encounter deck for any one non-objective card worth no victory points, add it to your victory display, shuffle the encounter deck. So, with the combination of both of these cards, you can really have some potent ability to attempt to neuter the encounter deck. So I'm not sure I agree with you, Mitch, when you say this Risk Some Light is I think you phrased it, the most potent way to deal with the encounter deck, because it's still there. But I think Risk Some Light in conjunction with Out of the Wild, which if you're playing lore and you're playing secrecy, I'm not really sure why you wouldn't use both, can both, I think, be used to great effect.
Right, so when I mentioned it was the most potent scrying effect, I suppose what I meant was in predictive capability. So whereas Out of the Wild lets you look at the top 5, you are shuffling the deck, whereas this allows you to potentially know what the top 3 encounter cards are, if you're not taking advantage of putting one of those at the bottom of the encounter deck. I certainly think that this is an effect that loses a little bit of potency the more players that you add to the game, so whereas in a single-player game this is potentially scrying 3 rounds worth of cards, in a 3 or 4 player game it's a single round or even less than a single round. I certainly think changing the order can be useful, so it can kind of buy you some time to deal with the worst effects. Even if you've got Surge upcoming, it allows you some predictive power. But the major problem for me, particularly as a player that generally plays 2-player games and isn't too interested in the secrecy mechanic, the top 3 cards certainly doesn't seem like much, and if I had to pick between the two, I'd certainly lean toward Out of the Wild.
So the final card of the Dwarrowdelf cycle of adventure packs is Vilya. It's a 2-cost attachment, which is both a ring and an artifact. It has to go on Elrond, and Elrond is going to gain the spirit resource icon. Action, exhaust Elrond and Vilya to reveal the top card of your deck. You can immediately play or put into play the revealed card for no cost, if able. Otherwise, move the revealed card to the bottom of your deck. So as Mitch mentioned when we were discussing Master of the Forge, if you're going to be playing Elrond, you're going to be playing Vilya. Just like if you're playing the Spirit version of Glorfindel, you need to be playing the Light of Valinor. So the Master of the Forge is able to help you find either of these 2 particular artifacts. Also, just like Master of the Forge, this combos very well with the Stargazer, in that you'll be less likely to whiff when you exhaust both Elrond and Vilya. I think it's quite handy that this gives Elrond the spirit resource icon, because not only does that open him up to pay for cancellation effects or unexpected courage, but it also means he can now pay for Miruvor. So if you're having to exhaust him and Vilya to get this effect, he can play Miruvor on himself without depending on another spirit hero or spirit player to really get the maximum effect out of this card.
So, given that this is an extremely powerful effect, I think one of the primary drawbacks to this card is that it drains Elrond's actions. So even though he's got incredible willpower, incredible defensive capabilities, and pretty decent attack power, you still have to exhaust him to take advantage of this. So I think, just like you mentioned, Light of Valinor, Elrond is also a fantastic contender for that. And the same goes with other effects like Unexpected Courage, just so you can take advantage of Vilya every round and use Elrond for something else. Since you mentioned the Imladris Stargazer, this allows players a fantastic ability to do all sorts of tricks. So the obvious use for Vilya is getting extremely powerful allies into play for free. And notice that nowhere on this card does it mention that they have to have a resource match with any of your heroes. So maybe on the first turn you play Vilya, you immediately exhaust it and Elrond, you reveal the top card of your deck, which is maybe something like Beorn or Gandalf, and you put them into play at no additional cost to you. If you're taking advantage of effects like Imladris Stargazer, you can time even events and attachments to derive fantastic effects out of them. So maybe you commit a ton of characters to the quest, and then you exhaust Elrond and Vilya to put Grim Resolve into play, and unexhaust all of your characters. Or maybe during the combat phase, you exhaust Elrond and Vilya to put a forest snare onto an enemy attacking you, so that you never have to wait for the planning phase. One of the most powerful and expensive allies that players might want to put into play with this effect is Gildor Inglorian himself, and once you have him on the table, you can use his action to maybe pull a card out of your hand, put it on top of your deck, maybe that Beorn that doesn't have a natural resource match with your heroes, and then you can trigger Vilya. So I think this is an incredibly potent effect, and as we see more and more powerful, particularly expensive cards come out as our card pool develops, this is a card that can only increase in potency. So, a couple last built-in bonuses to Vilya worth mentioning are if you're not running any powerful deck scrying effects. So if you don't have Imladris Stargazer or even Keen-Eyed Took to rely on, if you're triggering this blindly, hoping to hit big, if you do happen to reveal a card that's not eligible to interplay, so something like a Test of Will, which of course doesn't have a when revealed effect to cancel, you can simply put that card on the bottom of your deck, so maybe it's there to draw later, maybe it gets shuffled back near the top, or whatever happens to happen. There's also a very situational use, where if you have a restriction to the amount of cards that you're able to play, you can use that put into play effect. So maybe during the Escape from Dol Guldur, where the players are limited to one ally being played from their hands per turn, you can simply opt to put that ally into play, so you can kind of circumvent that effect. But all in all, no matter how you're playing this card, it nevertheless has the potential to be an absolute powerhouse. But that brings us to the end of our final Dwarrowdelf Adventure Pack player card review. Any final thoughts about this collection of cards, Matthew?
Well, first, it's almost hard to believe that we are at the end of the second cycle. We haven't yet had the Against the Shadow adventure packs start coming out, so this is our last adventure pack review for a while, though of course I'm sure it will be here before we know it. Specifically to these cards, you know, I am not a huge fan of Glorfindel. I've always sort of viewed him as cheating when you combine him with Asphalok and the Light of Valinor. I just find it to be too overpowered, if that makes sense. So if I didn't like Glorfindel, I like Elrond and Vilya even less. Now, I will, for the sake of full disclosure, when my buddies play Elrond, I certainly enjoy the extra healing that can happen as a result of his response, but it is just not a hero that fits my playstyle. I find him to be far too overpowered, provided everything works. I mean, if you don't get Vilya, you're not able to draw it, even with Masters of the Forge, even with Stargazers, then his potency is quite hampered. But it's just, I don't know. I don't know why I have such an aversion to him and his power. I should love powerful cards. I certainly love powerful tactics cards, but Elrond just doesn't really do it for me, and perhaps in large measure because that threat cost is just so daunting. With that said, I really like a lot of the cards in this adventure pack, as I mentioned when we discussed them individually. So I think the cycle sort of started off with a whimper. The first couple of adventure packs weren't that great, but each pack, starting with Watch from the Water forward, really introduced some powerful and excellent player cards. So I think by the end of the cycle, Khazad-dûm and Dwarrowdelf pooled together really expanded the player pool from the core set in Shadows of Mirkwood to make it much more diverse, lots of different strategies, and of course the dwarves are just fantastic.
Certainly, I think this adventure pack in particular adds some extremely powerful options for the players. So, whereas we saw Glorfindel start to challenge the power of the dwarves in providing an alternative for players that want to construct extremely powerful, extremely effective decks, Elrond and Vilya in particular introduce a captivating new mechanic that players particularly interested in very synergistic cards and clever combos and interesting effects that all come together to provide very potent effects would really enjoy. We've also seen a smattering of cards that appeal to characters with a more diverse base of interests. So players that like to use a lot of ranged characters have Hands Upon the Bow, and characters interested in secrecy have that potent new effect of O Elbereth Gilthoniel. But of course, we've also seen our fair share of cards that can appeal to any number of decks. So overall, I definitely think this adventure pack contains a pretty fascinating variety of powerful player cards that really helps to push the Dwarf and Noldor decks into separate but extraordinarily powerful, viable player decks. But I think that about does it for this video, so thank you very much for checking out our final player card review of the Dwarrowdelf cycle. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit that like button or subscribe to our channel if you have not done so already. If you'd like to share your own thoughts about our new hero or any of these player cards, feel free to leave us a comment below. Up next is going to be our actual scenario playthrough of the Shadow and Flame quest, so we'll see you again soon.